Live Fit Podcast, episode 65, Dairy. It still does a body good.
Unfortunately, the science they had at the time was not very complete. The people had a pretty narrow view of what that science said, and as a result, we had dietary guidelines that recommended that we consume low-fat diets and low-saturated fat diets. Unfortunately, over time, as the science evolved, that science didn't hold up, and what we see now today is science that says saturated fat is unlikely to be a risk factor for heart disease. From a scientific viewpoint, I have not seen any science that would support having any nutritional value, health benefit value from consuming raw milk over pasteurized milk. Fluid milk may be better at rehydrating you than water. Consuming more dairy without controlling for calories didn't have any benefit, but when you were restricting calories and made sure that you were getting adequate dairy as a part of that diet, you tended to lose more weight as body fat and lose less weight as lean body mass. So from a body composition point of view, you did much better when you had adequate dairy in your diet.
You're listening to the Live Fit Podcast with Glenn Johnson. Here, we'll talk about all things related to good health, fitness, food, fat loss, and the mind-body connection.
Yes, it is time once again for the Live Fit Podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Johnson. Thank you, everybody, for listening. It means a lot to me. This is episode 65, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Greg Miller. He is the Chief Science Officer for the National Dairy Council. He's going to tell us why milk is still one of the most nutritious and affordable foods available, how it helps people lose body fat, and why you should never drink raw milk. Dr. Miller is also going to talk about yogurt, cheese, casein, whey, and why milk is an excellent performance fuel for athletes. I know it works well for me. That's about all I have for an introduction today. Let's just get right on with the show, shall we? Good morning, Greg. How are you doing?
Great, thank you.
So I have Dr. Greg Miller on the line today, and you work for the National Dairy Council, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm the Chief Science Officer for the National Dairy Council.
And what exactly does that mean? What's your job entail?
Dairy farmers invest in what they call a checkoff program. So it's money that they take out of their pockets and give to us to invest in their behalf to increase awareness about dairy foods and the role dairy foods can play in a healthy diet. I oversee their investment in research. So we fund nutrition research at universities and medical schools across the globe, mainly in the U.S., to provide science-based information that we can use to talk about the role and the value of dairy foods in a healthy diet.
Great. And what kind of research is most recently revealed something positive or negative about dairy?
Well, there's been a lot of good news around dairy these days. The dietary guidelines for Americans talk about the consumption of milk and milk products and its relationship to reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and with lower blood pressure. So we've funded some of that work, and a lot of it's been funded by the government. We've also been funding work that shows that the consumption of whole milk dairy products is also associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. And in fact, the evidence now shows that the consumption of milk fat, regardless of fat level, can be a part of a healthy diet for good health.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you. When I grew up back in the 70s and 80s, fat was taboo. You were supposed to drink non-fat milk and non-fat yogurt and all those things, and we were supposed to not consume any fat. And now there's been some research that definitely shows that that was not very factual and that is not in our humans' best interest for good health. What can you tell me about that?
Well, it's one of those unfortunate situations where back in the late 50s, early 60s, the rates of heart disease were getting much higher. People were very concerned, and so they wanted to provide dietary guidance to the American population on how to eat to reduce their risk of heart disease. Unfortunately, the science they had at the time was not very complete. People had a pretty narrow view of what that science said, and as a result, we had dietary guidelines that recommended that we consume low-fat diets and low-saturated fat diets. Unfortunately, over time, as the science evolved, that science didn't hold up, and what we see now today is science that says saturated fat is unlikely to be a risk factor for heart disease, and it depends on what the food source of that saturated fat is too. So when we look at dairy foods, what we find is this very complex matrix of food called dairy foods is different than just being saturated fat. It's a mixture of many different types of fats, and so it turns out really doesn't increase our risk of cardiovascular disease.
Does it matter what form this dairy comes in? Cheese, yogurt, milk, etc.?
Well, right now the science is around both milk, cheese, yogurt, in those forms, regardless of fat level. Sometimes the data will say low fat or fat free might be a little bit better, but in totality, the data is showing that all dairy foods, milk, yogurts, and cheese, regardless of fat level, can be a part of a healthy diet.
Now, does it matter what the cow is eating?
Well, there's some data that says that grass-fed cattle have more omega-3s and more conjugated linoleic acid, which is a fatty acid that's been shown to have health benefits in milk from those animals. But really, you get a large percentage increase, but the percentage is on a very small actual amount. So really, it's not very significant in terms of your health. If you want to get omega-3s, you should eat fish or canola oil, but dairy products are really not a good source of omega-3s.
I see. So a grass-fed butter would have more omega-3 than a standard grain-fed butter, but it's not a significant difference. It might be a higher percentage because they're a percentage of the whole, but in actuality, it's not very much. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right. So you might hear a 50% increase in the omega-3s in milk from cattle-fed grass rather than grain. But that's 50% of a very, very, very small amount. So 50% more of nothing is nothing.
Yeah, that's true. That's pretty funny. I've been reading about dairy and hearing about it from time to time, and there really seems to be a toss-up on its health benefits. Depends on the source. Some people will say it's good for you. Some people say it's bad. Some will state the reasons. Some say that it's good for your bones. Some say that it doesn't really make a difference, that cultures that don't consume any dairy, the adults don't have as great of osteoporosis in their group as other groups do that do consume more dairy. So that tends to lend itself to, does milk really make a difference in bone health over time?
Yeah, well, again, I work for the dairy industry, so, obviously everybody knows what I'm going to say.
Right.
But look at what the dietary guidelines for Americans say. They say that dairy is important for good bone health, particularly in young kids. The American Academy of Pediatrics has gone on the record in saying that kids should consume 3 to 4 servings of dairy each day because it's very important for their bone growth and bone development. And so external experts who are looking at the totality of the science that's available have gone on record supporting the role and the value of dairy foods for good bone health. And there's plenty of science out there to show it. Now, is the data mixed? Sure. In some of these epidemiological studies, we see mixed outcomes. But again, we don't know if people drank more milk because they knew they were at risk for fracture, and that's why people who had more fractures had higher milk intake. The data is not very good in terms of the epidemiological data, but certainly the randomized controlled trials show that people who consume more dairy have better bone mineral density, particularly in younger kids. Now, the cross-cultural comparisons of different populations, well, they can be very misleading as well, too, because, they have different food supplies. So they may be getting more calcium because they're eating fish with the bones in it, which we don't traditionally do here in the U.S.
True.
Also, other populations, they're not as tall as we are in the U.S., so their skeletons are smaller, so their absolute calcium requirement may be a little bit lower. There are also genetic differences. For example, Asian folks who have less fracture in the hip than we do in the U.S., well, they have a different architecture in their bone. Their hip axis is smaller than what we have in the U.S., and so it's less likely to fracture. And there's a lot of other confounding variables that aren't often controlled for in these cross-cultural comparisons. Smoking, alcohol consumption, vertebral fractures, which are not very well recorded. A lot of Asians tend to have more vertebral fractures than hip fractures. And so making these cross-cultural comparisons can be misleading in terms of what they really tell you about the relationship between dairy foods and bone health and fracture risk.
And that is in fact the problem with hearing the quote unquote the report of a research study from the Daily News or the newspaper, TV, whatever it might be, is that they just pick one headline topic out of there. Oh, milk is good for you. Oh, milk is bad for you. And then they run with it and they act like that research is all inclusive and there's no interpretation involved. But in fact, there really is.
Yeah, it's kind of it's one of those good news, bad news things. I mean, everybody's a nutritionist because everybody eats, and now everybody's a journalist because everybody's online. Mm-hmm. And so you get people who don't have any expertise, and if they shout the loudest, it's the one that gets you the most attention. If we want to learn about something, we get online, we Google it. And the problem with that is that Google doesn't tell you what truth is. Google tells you what's trending. And that's unfortunate because I've seen it. The recent British medical journal article that came out of Sweden, which said people who consume more milk have more deaths and more fractures. And if you went back and really looked at that study closely, as a scientist, you would go, how did this even get published? They did one food frequency questionnaire and then 20 years later looked at outcomes. It's an interesting theoretical type of study, but really, from a scientific point of view, food frequency questionnaires don't tell us what people eat. They tell us what their intention to eat is. It's very hard to it doesn't tell us anything about cause and effect. Again, you do one food frequency questionnaire and then 20 years later look at outcomes. I'm sorry, as a scientist, that's just not high-quality science. But the headlines were all out there in mass that consumption of milk causes premature death, when in fact, if you look at the total body of science available, that's just not true. And it was based on one not very well-designed study.
Right, and there was a study that came out, I don't know how many years ago, 5-ish, maybe a little bit more, that the calcium in dairy products helped people lose weight. So then there was a big mad rush towards dairy products, and then not too long ago it came out that said that research didn't have a strong efficacy.
Well, there was a lot of good data epidemiologically. It was very consistent. There were animal models that began to tell us what the mechanism was of how dairy might be impacting weight and body composition. And what happened was, though, with the random clinical trials, the data started coming out mixed. And a lot of that then depended on study design. And what we've learned is that for dairy to really have a strong impact on weight and body fat, it's really under the auspice of caloric restriction. So consuming more dairy without controlling for calories didn't have any benefit. But when you were restricting calories and made sure that you were getting adequate dairy as a part of that diet, you tended to lose more weight as body fat and lose less weight as lean body mass. So from a body composition point of view, you did much better when you had adequate dairy in your diet.
So it doesn't necessarily cause you to lose weight, but it can certainly be a part of a good, healthy diet that is geared towards weight reduction, correct?
Correct. And I strongly recommend it because, again, what we see is sometimes you see better weight loss, particularly around the waist, but what you see is better weight loss in terms of body composition. Because if you're on a low-calorie diet and your dairy intake is low, again, you lose both lean body mass and body fat. With adequate dairy in your diet, you tend to lose more as body fat and